My second day in Rome turned out to be quite the epic journey. I crisscrossed the city from east to west, ticking off some of the most famous spots and seeing some which I did not even know about. Delving into cinematic Rome, even stepping out of Italy for a bit, only to get a complete feeling of the most ancient heart of the city. If yesterday's adventure sketched out the nose on the map, today we're adding a smile to the face. The links to both maps are as usual in the description, so feel free to adjust them to your liking. So, off we go! The day kicked off with a visit to a church that, according to yet another charming city legend, was built on the spot where snow mysteriously fell one August day in the mid-4th century. Now, even if we entertain the idea that the snow story is true, have you ever been to Rome in summer? No? Trust me, no amount of fountains can save you. But the church was actually constructed in the 5th century, in honor of the Virgin Mary, who had previously been proposed as not being the mother of Christ. Well, yes, religion has always been full of such twists and turns. So in honor of Saint Mary the Great, they built a church that was subsequently rebuilt many times. You could delve into its floor plan and search for remnants of the original structure, but you'd be better off noting its orientation. It still faces east, as it did in early Christian times. The church is almost entirely rebuilt, and nothing from the original exterior remains. The various facades of the church are all done in different styles. The main facade, still visible through the openings, is covered by a Baroque loggia, which in its day was used for papal appearances before the Pope relocated them to the Apostolic Palace. In front of the church stands a column with a statue, naturally of the Madonna and Child at the top, designed by Carlo Maderno, the same chap who did the facade of St. Peter's Basilica. But this isn't just any old column, it's the only surviving column from the Basilica of Maxentius and Constantine in the Roman Forum, built to commemorate Constantine's victory over Maxentius at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. Remember? That's where we started yesterday. Inside, Santa Maria Maggiore is truly impressive, primarily due to its sheer scale and opulence. And that's no surprise, considering that, for instance, the ceiling is adorned with gold from the very first batch brought, or rather plundered, from the New World. Naturally, it was the Spanish who brought it over, and those famous Catholic monarchs, Isabella and Ferdinand, whom I mentioned in this video from Alcalá de Henares, gifted this gold to Pope Alexander VI. The Basilica is also home to many significant tombs, from Napoleon's sister Pauline to Giovanni Bernini and even 5 popes. And that's not to mention the Basilica's most important relics, the Holy Crib, several pieces of wood believed to be from Christ's manger, in front of which stands a sculpture of praying Pope Pius IX, and also a set of remnants belonging to Saint Matthias. I saw and showed you his other parts in Trier. Also, here lies, or rather was reburied, Jerom of Stridon, the legendary author of the Vulgate, the canonical Latin translation of the Bible. There's even a legend that it's him who is to blame for Michelangelo's Moses having horns, but that's just a myth. I'll tell you more about it when we get to the statue of Moses himself. Jerom isn't actually guilty of that, but he was definitely responsible for the story of a lion that worked as a donkey. Can you imagine such a thing? The Basilica even has its own Sistine Chapel. No, it's not adorned with frescoes by Michelangelo or Raphael, and it's altogether simpler. The Pope Sixtus in question was a different one, but opposite it is the Cappella Paulina, where 2 more popes are buried, including the anti-Semitic Clement VIII, who, on top of everything else, executed Beatrice Cenci, seized her wealth and burned Giordano Bruno at the stake. I'll be recalling that later. After Santa Maria Maggiore, the next stop, San Pietro in Vincoli, made quite the contrast. It's a very simple church, both outside and even in, despite being built around the same time, in the 4th century. Its real treasure lies within. And while some may feel that the unfinished tomb of Pope Julius II is sacrilegious for comparing the Pope to the Prophet, or that the angle isn't quite right, and here we have Wolflin again. In Florence, which has its own separate episode on this channel, he wasn't impressed by David and here by Moses, but I personally would rather agree with Giorgio Vasari.
The statue surpasses all contemporary works. With his hand, he holds his lone bird, which cascades in strands, so finely carved from marble that the hair, a challenge in sculpture, is depicted so delicately, soft and combed, that it seems as if the impossible has happened, and the chisel has become a brush. Not to mention the way the garment is carved, and how beautifully and perfectly the muscles and veins in the hands and arms, and equally in the legs, are rendered. The work is so complete that Moses can be called a friend of God more than ever, who through Michelangelo's hands recreated his body and prepared it for resurrection from the dead.
Now, do you know why Moses is depicted with horns? No, it's not a case of the sculpture taking the mickey. There's a legend that the translator, yes, the very same Jerome who's buried in Santa Maria Maggiore, mixed up similar words and mistranslated radiance as horns. But as usual, that's just a legend. I don't normally dwell on such things, but this one had me pondering for so long that I decided to get to the bottom of it. In fact, Jerome did write about horns, but not out of ignorance. At the time, horns were associated with both earthly and divine power, and even the Old and New Testaments were compared to 2 horns. No one seemed particularly bothered about this. There's even an illustration where Moses and the demon Belial, at a trial between Satan and Christ before Solomon, both have horns. So it's just another religious metaphor for omnipotence. The church ceiling was painted by Giovanni Battista Parodi. His fresco, The Miracle of the Chains, depicts the healing of the local saint Balbina by Pope Alexander I, who touched her with the chains that, according to legend, once shackled St. Peter. The very chains after which the church is named are here too. But no, you can't touch them anymore. Miracles aren't handed out like sweets. You'll need to go to see a doctor for that. Not far from San Pietro in Vincoli, you'll spot Rome's biggest celebrity. I know, I promised to dodge the tourist traps, but bear with me. How could I possibly skip this beauty? It's the Flavian Amphitheatre, or as everyone calls it, the Colosseum. Though, funny enough, that wasn't its original name. No one's quite sure where it came from. Maybe it's because it's massive, or maybe it's named after some statue or temple of Isis that used to be nearby. We don't know now. Anyway, this beast was built in the late 1st century, right where Nero used to have his fancy lakeside pad. Talk about good location here. The arena was mostly for entertainment. You know, the usual Roman fun. When Christianity came along, they ditched the gladiator fights but kept the animal hunts happily going till the 6th century. Would you believe it, the place even did a stint as a fortress and a saltpeter factory at one point. The building, been through the wars, fires, earthquakes, you name it. They've patched it up a few times, but always trying to keep it looking original. The big disaster was the earthquake of 1349. It knocked down the whole south side, which never got rebuilt. After that, people started nicking bits for their own buildings. See those marks on the walls? That's where the marble used to be. On the bright side, Now we can see how the whole thing was put together. It was like a massive, violent cinema, the emperor and the Vestal virgins having seats along the arena's long axis, nobles and senators at the bottom around, equestrians just above, then the Roman citizens. The wealthier one just behind the equestrians, the less well off a bit further back. Under Domitian, at the end of the 1st century, rows were added at the very top for women, plebeians and slaves. And if you were a gravedigger, actor or ex-gladiator, tough luck mate, no entry for you at all. We could spend ages here, but let's move on down this restored Roman road. We're heading to that fancy arch just over there. Actually, it's called the Arch of Constantine, and according to the most likely theory, it was built to commemorate Constantine's victory. That's right, over Maxentius at the Battle of Milvian Bridge. I told you that was important. There are theories, mind you, that the arch was simply repurposed by Constantine from an arch of Domitian or Adrian, the same divine one whose temple I've already told you about, or even Maxentius, whom Constantine defeated. Undoubtedly, many decorations were reused, so attribution is rather tricky. As often happens, modern researchers tend to complicate things, explaining the use of elements from Trajan's and Adrian's monuments as Constantine's attempt to align himself with the so-called good emperors. But, in fact, I reckon it's all much simpler. There just wasn't such reverence for old structures, and they simply used them again. In any case, the dedication of the arch is quite remarkable. Today's inscription states that Constantine defeated the tyrant and all his supporters by divine inspiration and greatness of spirit. But beneath these words lies an earlier version, by the will of Jupiter. And there's no conspiracy here. At the time of his victory over Maxentius, Constantine hadn't yet turned to Christianity or planned to build a future Istanbul. He was a normal, healthy pagan. Next up is a bit of a movie star spot. Now, I'm not usually one for sticking my hand in ancient drain covers, but on my first trip we went full tourist and did the whole Gregory Peck and Audrey Hepburn routine. This time though, I popped into the nearby Santa Maria in Cosmedin church. It's from the 6th century, which might not sound that old compared to the other stuff we've seen. But believe me, it's interesting inside. Turns out I'm a lover of small, cozy churches. This one's kept most of its early medieval look, though it's been done up quite a bit over the years, but without that annoying everything is so shiny new feel. Maybe it's because it wasn't a big important church to begin with. So they had to make do with what they had. When they needed columns, they just grabbed whatever they could find nearby. Result? Not a single matching pair in the whole place. You could bring architecture students here to show them all the options at the same site. Oh, and get this, they've got St. Valentine's skull in there. But here's the kicker. It's not the Valentine's Day one, it's some other bloke with the same name. Can you imagine the confusion that might cause? No, not that Valentine, the other one. Right in front of Santa Maria in Cosmedin, you've got Rome's oldest forum, the Cattle Forum. There was a ford across the Tiber here, but it doesn't look like they were flogging cows. Maybe there was a statue of a bull nearby, but that's just one theory. Your guess is as good as mine. The spot's proper old, mind you. Used to be outside the city walls packed with pagan temples. Take this one for example. It's dedicated to Hercules. Legend has it that Evander, the bloke who founded a settlement here before Rome was even a thing, built it after bumping into Hercules himself. Apparently, Herc was just passing through after his 10th labor, nicking Gerion's cows, as you do in the evening. Oh, and get this! Some reckon Pallas, the chap who gave his name to the Palatine Hill, was the son of Evander's daughter and Hercules. Sounds like Evander had plenty of reasons to celebrate meeting the future god, eh? On the same Cattle Forum, you'll spot the Fountain of the Tritons. It's not working now, mine. Don't mix it up with the Bernini's one I showed you earlier. That's got just one Triton. This one got two for the price of one. Carlo Bizzaccheri knocked it up in 1717 for Pope Clement XI. The base looks a bit like the Fountain of the Four Rivers. Those rocky bases became all the rage after Bernini's success in Piazza Navona. Now I'm off up this quirky staircase. Any idea what's it called? Pop your guesses in the comments. Oh, and while you're at it, have a think about why the steps are such an odd width. Not exactly easy to walk on, are they? When you get to the riverbank, have a gander behind you, and you'll see Rome's oldest stone bridge. It used to connect the Cattle Forum with Trastevere, and it's called the Ponte Milius, or Ponte Rotto if you're feeling Italian. Do you remember that Roman stone bridge I showed you in Trier? Well, this one's even older. We're talking about 2nd century BC. Though after a few floods, there's only one arch left standing. Since 1887, it's just been sitting there, not touching either bank. Funny to think there might still be some 19th century rubbish up there. That's quite the standing the test of time. Do you fancy getting to the other side of the Tiber? Well, you can nip across Rome's only island, Tiber Island. The bridge to get there is called Ponte Fabricio, Rome's oldest bridge, still doing its job. It's been standing there since 62 BC thanks to a bloke called Lucius Fabricius. Some folks call it the Bridge of Four Heads because of those quirky sculptures at the entrance with 4 noggins each. Fancy that. In the Middle Ages, they called it the Jewish Bridge because the Jewish ghetto was right next to it until 1870. Now you can see just 2 arches and a little window between them for when the river gets a bit rowdy. Actually, there are 2 more 6-meter spans on each side, but they're hidden now. The banks got a bit of a makeover. Back in 573, they moved Rome's mills here because the current was so fast. By 1746, there were 8 of them. All well and good, but they made the river flow a bit dodgy, which was a right pain when the Tiber decided to have a tantrum. The mills gradually disappeared, but their leftovers were still causing trouble. In the 1980s, some bright spark suggested filling in the left branch of the Tiber. Well, thanks goodness they didn't, or we'd be down one lovely island. Smack in the middle of the island, where an old temple to Asclepius used to be, there's been a church to St. Bartholomew since 998. They reckon they've got some of his remains in there, but that's not the cool bit. They've got this very unusual and somehow wonderful collection of stuff from all sorts of people who got in trouble for their faith. From the obvious ones like missionaries in far-flung places to priests who saved people from the Nazis. On the other side of the island, there's another old bridge, Ponte Chestio. The first version was built in the 1st century BC, but the one you see now has had a bit of work done. Trastevere, where I ended up, is one of those parts in Rome where you don't get swamped by tourists. If you're after a masterpiece on every corner, you might find it a bit dull. But if you fancy a peek at what Rome was like in the 60s and 70s, it's a right treat for a wanderer. If you do pop over to Trastevere, stick your head in Santa Cecilia. Legend has it that the first church popped up here in the 3rd or 5th century, right where Cecilia used to live. The church you see now was built in the 9th century and got a Baroque makeover in the 16th. The main attractions are Stefano Maderno's Martyrdom of Santa Cecilia sculpture from the 1600s and Pietro Cavallini's Last Judgment fresco from the late 13th century. But I couldn't get a proper look at any of those. Because it looked like Armani models were marrying off a daughter from a Secret Service family. Quite a colorful crowd, but surprisingly friendly to outsiders, I must say. And boy, Italians do know how to dress up.
Siete disposti, seguendo la via del matrimonio, ad amarvi e onorarvi l'un l'altro per tutta la vita? Sì.
Good luck to you both, and drop me a line if you see this video. The other church worth a look in Trastevere is Santa Maria. Story goes, an oil fountain suddenly sprouted here in the 3rd century, which they took as a good sign to build a church. Why a dark oily goop was seen as a good omen is beyond me, but they built it anyway. They expanded it in the 4th century, again in the 10th, and in the 12th they slapped on a bell tower and made it even bigger. In the 17th century, they added a portico and chuckled in loads of bits from the church's older versions. Decorations, memorial plaques, and what looks like ancient graffiti. Real art buffs will probably go wild over the fancy gold ceiling and Domenichino's Assumption of the Virgin painting. That's all well and good, of course, but what really knocked my socks off was the massive mosaic in the apse, instead of a painting. Turns out it dates back to the 12th century, with some 13th century additions by Pietro Cavallini. How these mosaics have managed to stick around is beyond me. Sure, they've been looked after and restored, but what kind of know-how and materials did they have back then? Maybe the Middle Ages weren't as dark as I thought. I'll admit, it looks pretty swanky. The central bit is framed by granite columns, nicked from the ancient Roman baths of Caracalla, as per usual in Rome. I get it in the not-so-posh Santa Maria in Cosmedin, but why are they all different here too? As everywhere else, the church is chock full of important people's graves. But it always rubs me the wrong way when they suggest you walk all over their tombstones. Now, take your pick of bridges to cross the Tiber back to the left bank. How about the Ponte Chestio, a delightful piece of 15th century old craftsmanship? Once across and a bit further, you'll find yourself at one of Rome's oldest spots, steeped in a pretty bloody history. And the best part? It's absolutely free to explore. You can meander around it with an amazing gelato taking in the sights, because, let's face it, a bit of sugar makes history even sweeter. Welcome to Largo Argentina, named after a long-gone tower that once graced the residence of one Johannes Burckhardt. This chap was quite the bigwig, master of ceremonies to 5 popes from 1483. That's Sixtus IV, Innocent VIII, Alexander VI the Borgia, Pius III and Julius II, in case you're counting. Burckhardt hailed from Strasbourg, which was known in Latin as Argentoratum, so he fancied signing his name as Argentius. He snapped up some land in this area where the ruins of Pompey's theatre once stood, bulldozed the medieval buildings that were there, and built his palace. Now, if you're eyeing that square tower near the museum, let me stop you there. It's the Torre del Papito, a medieval tower that has absolutely nothing to do with Torre Argentina. Confusing? Well, welcome to Rome! But let's finally get to the juicy part. This square has a claim to fame that's hard to beat. Back in the day, this very spot was home to the Pompey Theatre, completed in 55 BC. This wasn't just any theatre, it was a colossal structure, the sort that would still make headlines even today. It sprawled over several blocks to the east of what's now Piazza Torre Argentina, ending around Campo di Fiore. If you look closely, you'll notice that this part of the city still follows the outline of the ancient amphitheater. The theater wasn't just for show. Its gardens housed the so-called Curia of Pompey, a building where the Senate met. And it was here that a certain chap came to a Senate meeting. Now, does he look familiar? Yes, indeed, it's Gaius Julius Caesar himself, consul, serial dictator, and a power grabber extraordinaire. Known for his electoral shenanigans, bribery, treaty breaking, and all the delightful perks of absolute power. His love life? Well, let's just say it's as tangled as a bowl of spaghetti. 3 wives, maybe 4, numerous lovers, plus a notorious affair with Cleopatra, who bore him a son, and consequently a mass of children, some of whom might have had a hand in his downfall. How very dictatorial. So, you've guessed it. The Ides of March 44 BC, right here. Caesar was done in by a group of conspirators, including Marcus Junius Brutus, who might have been one of Caesar's illegitimate sons. And the deed was done right where that lone pine tree stands today. Now, I won't bore you with the gory details. No one wants to nod off halfway through a tale. But I will mention that Caesar's supposed last words are as varied as they come. At least 5 different phrases are recorded, but none are confirmed. Some say he fought back at first, but went silent when he saw Brutus, pulling his toga over his head in surrender. Not the cheeriest note to end on, so let's brighten things up with what remains here. Look around and you'll see some of Rome's oldest buildings. Sure, they're not as flashy as those glittering churches with their frescoes and mosaics, but these temples have been standing for over 2,300 years. There are 4 of them, so let's have a peek. The one on the far right, with the dark steps, is likely the Temple of Juturna, goddess or nymph of fountains and springs. It was built by Gaius Latanius Catulus in 241 BC after his victory over the Carthaginian fleet, securing Rome's win in the First Punic War. The second temple, the round one with 6 columns still standing, was so admired by Cicero that he practically wrote love letters to it. It was built by another member of the Latanius Catulus clan, Quintus, to celebrate his victory over the Cimbri, a Germanic tribe at Vercellae. To thank the gods for their help, he popped a massive 8-meter statue of the goddess Victory inside. Bronze body with marble head, hands and feet. The statue was found and now lounges at the capital in museums, though the bronze bits were likely melted down when Rome went Christian. The third and fourth temples were discovered when the second one was being dug up. The third, with dark steps, is the oldest of the lot, dedicated to Feronia, a goddess with a CV as long as your arm. Fertility, fields, forest, medicinal herbs, she handled the lot, including the liberation of slaves. This temple dates back to the 3rd or 4th century BC, but was given a facelift in 80 AD after a fire. The last temple, from the 2nd century BC, is the biggest, but sadly it's the most hidden one because the road runs right over it. It is dedicated to the Lares per Marini, those charming little house gods of sailors. Apuleius, the ancient writer, believed that good people became Lares after they died. But only the good ones, no place for the nasty or nutty. Our next stop is Sant'Andrea della Valle, the largest Baroque church in Rome. It took 60 years to build, from 1590 to 1650, and it belongs to the 13 Order, blokes I hadn't heard of before this. These lads have an interesting approach. Instead of hiding away in monasteries, they stay among the people, preaching and serving as parish priests. Inside, you'll find an impressive fresco telling the story of St. Andrew, painted by 2 artists, Giovanni Lanfranco and Domenichino. I have already shown you some of Domenichino's works before, and Lanfranco was the favorite of Cardinal Alessandro, who took over the construction of the church after the original patron, Cardinal Gesualdo, passed away. Domenichino, in turn, was backed by the Ludovisi family, who were pretty influential at the Vatican. One of them even became Pope Gregory XV during the construction of the church, and is now buried in the Church of St. Ignatius, which I've already shown you. Sant'Andrea della Valle has its own Strozzi chapel, with replicas of Michelangelo's Pietà and Leah and Rachel, but the real showstopper is the frescoes. They're so stunning that there's a special mirror installed just for ogling them. No wonder Giacomo Puccini picked this church for the first act of his opera Tosca. Though in true operatic fashion, he did invent a chapel for dramatic effect. And now we're off to a square with a jolly name but a rather grim backstory. Campo di Fiore literally means the field of flowers. Back in the day, this area wasn't exactly the place to be. Up until the 15th century, it was little more than a soggy field, regularly flooded and largely underdeveloped. As the city expanded, Campo di Fiore remained a bit of a working-class neighborhood. With streets named after bowmakers, keysmiths, tailors and hatters, it was never the place for grand mansions or posh residents. Instead, the area was a colorful jumble of houses, teeming with inns and taverns. One of these, the Taverna della Vacca, was owned by none other than Vanozza dei Catanei, the official mistress of Pope Alexander VI. Believe it or not, it's still standing. As the area grew, a horse market started up on Mondays and Saturdays, bringing a bit of wealth to the neighborhood. By 1860, the fish and vegetable market from Piazza Navona had been moved here, and the old horse fountain was repurposed for watering flowers, which are still sold here today. The fountain bears the inscription, "Do good and let them talk," a cheeky nod to the endless gossip that always swirls around markets. In the 2000s, the square became infamous for drunken tourist brawls and football fan scuffles. But even before that, it wasn't exactly a picnic spot. Public executions were a regular feature here. The most famous victim was probably Giordano Bruno, burned at the stake on 17 February 1600 by order of Pope Clement VIII, whom I mentioned during our visit to Santa Maria Maggiore. Bruno was gagged during his execution, so terrifying were his heretical views. Though some say he managed to utter something heroic as the flames licked his feet, but who can verify that now? Personally, I find the gagged version more believable, given the church's fear of science at the time. His ashes were tossed into the Tiber, and it wasn't until 1889 that a monument was erected in his honor, surrounded by scenes from his life. The infamous debates in Oxford, followed by the trial, and then finally the execution, with the inscription, "From the century he foresaw, on the spot where the stake burned." You know the saddest part of all that? Did you know that the church still considers Bruno's execution justified and sees no need to rehabilitate him? But Bruno wasn't the only one to meet a grim fate here. Real criminals, murderers and poisoners were also dealt with, like the women involved in the infamous Spana case, who made and sold poison in the mid-17th century. And let's not forget the ceremonial book burnings. In 1553, the Talmud was burned here by order of the papal court, and a memorial plaque next to Bruno's monument commemorates this dark episode. Quite a mix of history, isn't it? Rome, as always, is a city of contrasts, where splendor meets tragedy, and the past is never quite past. So, as we leave Campo di Fiore behind, let's keep wandering through this eternal city with all its secrets and surprises still waiting to be discovered. Next up, it's time to cross the Tiber once again. The bridge before the Castel Sant'Angelo, built by none other than Emperor Adrian again, was once the sole gateway to both the castle and St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican. Back in the Middle Ages, this bridge was even dubbed the Bridge of St. Peter. In the mid-15th century, the sheer number of people crossing it caused the railings to collapse, sending pilgrims tumbling into the river. Naturally, the bridge was repaired, and in the 16th century, none other than Raffaello da Montelupo, who crafted the first angel statue atop the castle, adorned it with 14 statues. Later, in the 17th century, Pope Clement IX ordered the statues to be replaced. The new sculptures were entrusted to Bernini, though the Pope, being the Pope, couldn't resist keeping two of Bernini's works for himself. As a result, the bridge now boasts two copies of Bernini's originals, with the remaining sculptures being authentic works by his students. And you know, I must admit, I rather prefer the students' pieces to Bernini's own. Our next stop is what was once the tallest building in Rome. Yes, that same Emperor Adrian, whom I've mentioned a few times now, decided to build himself a mausoleum here. You know, it's serious business, not something you'll delegate lightly. By 139 AD, the mausoleum stood tall, presumably clad in marble. For nearly 80 years, it served as the final resting place for emperors until the castle was sacked and thoroughly plundered in 410 AD. Over the years, the structure was transformed, morphing from a mausoleum into a fortified stronghold. It even acquired a passetto, a corridor similar to Vasari's that I showed you in Florence, allowing the Pope to move safely between the Vatican and the castle. The castle also came to house luxurious papal apartments, though these were quite conveniently close to the prison, from which only one escape was ever made. Among the notable guests of this prison were Giordano Bruno and, for example, Count Cagliostro. The castle's name dates back to 590 AD, when Pope Gregory the Great, during yet another plague outbreak, reportedly saw an archangel sheathing his sword above the fortress. The Pope took this as a sign that the plague would soon end, which frankly it was just as well, since there was little else they could do about the plague at the time. The epidemic's end simply meant that half of the city had perished. The name stuck, but the statue atop the castle has changed over time. Until the mid-18th century, it was a figure by Raffaello da Montelupo, now relocated into the inner courtyard, and later replaced with a bronze one. Inside the castle, there's a peculiar long circular passage that dates back to Adrian's time, leading to the burial chamber where the urns of the emperors once stood. There's likely a way to climb to the top, but alas, I didn't have time for that. And since we are at Castel Sant'Angelo, it's impossible not to mention Rome's most famous attraction, which isn't actually in Rome. This is the border that separates Rome from Vatican City. There's no customs or passport control, of course, but something clearly changes, as all the local homeless people sleep exclusively in Vatican City at night, not in Italy. Talking about the Vatican really requires its own dedicated episode. Otherwise, it feels somewhat disrespectful to the sheer number of artifacts housed within such a small area. There's the Sistine Chapel, the Vatican Museums and Library, and of course St. Peter's Basilica. You absolutely must climb the dome, not for the view, but to admire it from the inside. It's worth entering the Basilica itself too, though sometimes you'll need to queue for a bit, so get there early. Outside, it's definitely worth taking a stroll around St. Peter's Square. Those in the know might compare it to St. Paul's Cathedral in London, which I talked about in a previous episode. No need to remind you that the fountains are drinkable. A true blessing in the heat, but many people don't know that there are two special spots on either side of the square, marked by bronze plaques in the cobblestones. These are the centers of curvature for the colonnades surrounding the square, and from these points the rows of columns merge into one. Did you know, by the way, that Vatican City is the only country in the world with zero birth rate? Or that its citizenship automatically ceases when you stop working for the Holy See? Or that, proportionally speaking, it's the most militarized state in the world? Alright, that's just a trick of the low base effect, of course, but the Swiss guard is still recruited exclusively from unmarried Swiss Catholics who speak German and wear medieval costumes. Although the idea that Michelangelo designed their outfits is just another myth. And with all that, I think it's time to pause our stroll for today. Not end it, mind you, only put it on hold. I have shown you just a tiny part of the Rome you could explore for not just days, but weeks and even months. Fancy the museums? Well, there's the Capitoline Museums, the Vatican Museums, and dozens more. Or perhaps the culinary delights? Don't forget to try the Roman-style artichokes then. Or maybe you just want to wander the streets where so many beloved films were shot. There's no doubt Rome is well worth visiting, but I highly recommend figuring out what you want to see first. I just hope this brief episode has given you some idea of the possibilities. And naturally, you won't be able to see it all in one visit, or even 2, or 3. So until next time, arrivederci, Roma!